Next up, we have Jenny Davis and Meaghan Conway with United States Fish and Wildlife Service ESA status for the Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo.
So when this symposium first came about, there was a bunch of questions about how the road recovery and the working group was going to fit in with the ESA process, the ESA recovery planning process. So I kind of volunteered us to give a talk about where we were in the recovery process and what we will be doing in the future. And so Meaghan is our national lead for the cuckoo. I'm our lead in New Mexico with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So Meaghan's going to take it on from this part.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. And your ones, yeah, okay. Thanks everyone for organizing the symposium. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's talks. So as Jenny mentioned, we're just going to provide some updates from Fish and Wildlife, some recent actions and some details on our plans for the status and assessment, for the status assessment and recovery plan and what our timelines can be. So we'll start on a few quick updates on a few recent actions, since both of these included compiling a lot of information that might be useful. The first is a response to a petition to delist. We issued a not warranted decision in September of 2020, meaning that the western population of the cuckoo keeps its threatened status. So this decision included a review of the analysis to designate the western population of the cuckoo as a distinct population segment, or DPS. And what a DPS designation is just based on discreteness and significance of the population. So genetic data wasn't conclusive to designate it as a specific subspecies. This discreteness is usually based on geographic, behavioral, and morphological differences that distinguish it from Eastern populations. And the significance is due to the large gap in distribution that would result from the loss of the DPS. The decision was also based on updated threats analysis, where the determined threats that were included in the original listing decision still persist. Things like altered hydrology, livestock grazing, and also added additional threats that were identified, such as minerals mining in Southeast Arizona. So the list of the threats assessment and an updated information on historical and current population status are both available as supporting documents in the Federal Register. We can provide links for those if folks need them. You can move to the next slide. So we designated and finalized critical habitat in April of this year, and includes close to 300,000 acres of land in portions of Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, New Mexico, Texas, and Utah. And critical habitat is just defined as areas within the geographical range occupied by the species at the time of listing, which contain physical or biological features that are both essential to the conservation of the species and may require special management or protection. And those are described in the final rule, which include specific habitat descriptions of riparian or zero riparian woodlands, prey abundance, and specific hydrological conditions. We can also include areas outside of the range occupied by the species, but that would require just documenting that it's essential to the conservation of the species. The critical habitat designation doesn't signal that the habitat outside this area is unimportant or may not be needed for the recovery. And in fact, not all occupied habitat was included in the designation. So for example, the lower Colorado River was excluded because there's an existing management and conservation plan for that area. And through this process, we compiled a great deal of occurrence data from across the range of the Western DPS, mainly composed of state heritage databases and complemented by eBird data. And that shapefile that shows where critical habitat occurs is available, I think, till the end of the month on our ECOS website. So you can go to the next slide, and Jenny's going to take over and describe the recovery planning and implementation process.
So the recovery planning kind of starts out with a species status assessment, an SSA, and that's kind of where we are now, by diving into the species biology along with the present and future threats to the species. The SSA is then used to inform the recovery plan, which includes the 3 statutory elements: the recovery criteria, recovery actions, and the time and cost estimates for those actions. The recovery plan is then implemented via a recovery implementation strategy, or an RIS, which contains the specific on-the-ground activities that are stepped down from the recovery actions. I'll talk more about the details in a moment, but first I wanted to give you an overview of the complete package. In the recovery planning process, we evaluate the current and future conditions of the species using the 3 R's of conservation biology. Resiliency, the ability of a species at population scale to withstand environmental stochasticity, normal year-to-year variations in environmental conditions such as temperature and rainfall, periodic disturbances within the normal range of variation, fire, floods, storms, and demographic stochasticity, the normal variation in demographic rates such as mortality and fecundity. This is dependent on habitat quantity and quality, size of population, types of events that they're likely to face. And redundancy, the ability of a species to withstand catastrophes. Within the SSA context, catastrophes are large or regional scale stochastic events that are likely to result in population collapse, regardless of population health. This represents the likelihood that all populations are exposed to a single catastrophic event. A species with a higher number of resilient populations that are more geographically spread out have a higher likelihood of withstanding these catastrophic events. And then finally, representation. The ability of a species to adapt to both near-term and long-term novel changes in its physical and biological environments. This ability to adapt to new environments, referred to as adaptive capacity, is essential for viability. A species need to continually adapt to their changing environments. Essentially, it's a measure of genetic diversity and ecological diversity across the range. Together, the 3 R's help us understand the species viability, which we define as the ability of a species to sustain populations in the wild over time. So right now we're starting with the SSA. An SSA is used to deliver foundational science for informing all ESA decisions using a focused, repeatable, and rigorous scientific risk assessment. The framework suggests a more coordinated management process focused on achieving better conservation results from our endangered species program functions, other service partners, other service programs, and our outside partners. The framework has 3 conditions: the species needs, the current condition, and the future condition. Now we're going to briefly walk through the 3-stage framework to show you what's actually involved in the analysis. We identify the needs at 3 scales: the individual, population, and species level. Starting with individuals, we identify resources related to habitat or circumstances that individuals need in order to carry out their life cycle. And then at the population level, we examine what populations need for resiliency and to persist on the landscape over time. So here we think a lot about the population dynamics like population growth, reproductive rates, immigration and immigration, and mortality rates, among others. And then finally, at the species level, we bring in the other 2 R's, redundancy and representation, to examine what the species needs in terms of the number and distribution of populations in order to withstand catastrophic events, and the diversity and adaptive capacity of the species in the face of novel changes to the environment. The second stage of the SSA examines the species' current condition. So we look at both the current threats and conservation efforts and look at what is happening on the ground right now. In this stage, we'll do things such as identify and map populations or other units for analysis, document past trends in habitat and demographics, identify key demographic and habitat factors for the species, complete a cause and effects analysis to understand how the stressors and threats and conservation efforts have affected those habitat and demographics, and then characterize the current condition in terms of 3 R's. So the third stage of the SSA examines the species future condition. We use scenario analysis to project the plausible future threats and species responses under various scenarios. This paints us a picture of the range of plausible future conditions of the species in terms of the 3 R's. The graph here is an example of an SSA that projected the probability of extinction under 2 scenarios in blue and green, 50 years out into the future. So moving on from the SSA is used to inform the recovery plan. So the recovery plan contains a concise introduction with a recovery vision and recovery strategy. Then it focuses on the statutory requirements of recovery criteria, actions, and time and cost estimates. And then finally, the recovery implementation strategy implements the recovery plan through more detailed recovery activities. So overall, the recovery plan should serve as a broad vision for recovery of the species, informing the public of the criteria the service will use to determine when recovery is met, the high-level actions, and the time and cost needed to reach these recovery goals. The recovery vision describes the state of the species in terms of the 3 R's and relevant risk factors or threats. When the goal of recovery has been achieved and the protections of the ESA are no longer needed. This is essentially describing what you think the future will look like once the species is recovered. The species ecological needs determined during stage 1 of the SSA support the development of this recovery vision. The recovery strategy describes the conservation path considered most promising for achieving the recovery vision. The results of the SSA may suggest a strategy, or developing the strategy may be additional analysis done during the recovery plan. In general, strategies are defined as careful game plans for achieving major aims, usually over a long period of time. And the strategy is not just a list of actions, but rather prioritization and the scheduling of broad categories of actions in order to meet the vision. Then the recovery criteria describes the objective measurable thresholds. So that's actual numbers or rates or amounts, both in terms of demographics and risk factor or threat amelioration to know when you've met the recovery vision. Because these are actual thresholds, the SSA will support but not quite answer what the criteria will be. The work done in future conditions of the SSA, including describing what the risk factors are for the species currently and then in the future, will be very useful in helping to set the types of criteria needed, both demographically and in ameliorating the threats. So the recovery actions are those management interventions needed to achieve the recovery criteria. The cause and effect analyses conducted in the SSA will inform the recovery actions on a broad scale. There may be additional work that would be needed to prioritize the actions and to include stressors that may not have been deemed a population or species level effect, but that recovery planners might still want to focus on. Actions in a plan are higher order at a strategic level, while actions in the RAS focus on the tactical level of how to implement the actions in the plan. Every RAS activity must actually tie back to an action in the plan. So that's kind of the overview of exactly what we'll need to do. And now Megan's going to come back and she'll give us an overview of the timeline.
Yeah, so this is just a broad general timeline of what we're planning. We had our first meeting last week, and we'll be sending out letters to tribes, state, federal agencies, and other interested parties, hopefully by the end of this month, to solicit information. In the beginning of the process, we'll include a literature review and conceptual models of species needs and stressors, and a data assessment that contains a list of targeted questions that will help us ID where the knowledge gaps are. The process also includes an analysis of current conditions, linking stressors to species needs, and kind of describing why populations are in their current condition. And then developing future scenarios and forecasting population status under future conditions. So the information on ecological relationships described in the previous steps will help inform how species will respond and how their ability to sustain populations may change under each scenario. And we'll solicit input from species leads across Fish and Wildlife and others in recovery programs within Fish and Wildlife, and as well as experts, tribes, state agency biologists throughout this process. And we'll do that by hosting likely quarterly meetings for review and for folks to provide input and expertise and make sure we're including the best available information. So we plan to have a draft by January 2023 to send out for peer review and review by our partner agencies, and then a final SSA report by April of 2023. The recovery planning process will likely start shortly after. We'll take about 1.5 years to complete a draft, and then another year for the final recovery plan. So of course, there's lots of actions for conservation and recovery that can be implemented before a final recovery plan is implemented. And I think that's it. If folks have questions.
Actually, I think we're going to hold the questions until we're all together in the panel. Just kidding. Yes, questions, please.
Okay.
For this round, definitely. Neil has a question.
Hey, Megan and Jenny, thanks for the presentation. My question is about opportunities for input. I've been involved in a couple SSA processes. It's been a while since I've been involved in a recovery planning effort. My recent memory for SSAs is, there's opportunity through the peer review process, and it's felt sort of like a select group of outside experts that have been able to weigh in throughout the development of the SSA. Are there or can there be opportunities for a group like this to provide input throughout? And maybe also a follow-up, can you describe through the development of the recovery plan where there are opportunities for public input as well?
Yeah, I think I can answer some of that. We'll definitely be soliciting input from, as I said, folks from within Fish and Wildlife that are cuckoo experts and experts across, tribes, agencies, and other researchers. So the idea is to host a meeting to present what we've done and have kind of like a webinar type meeting where folks can provide input, and we'll send drafts out for review. So we're trying to get a broad kind of group for that, and definitely including folks that would have information that might be relevant. So. And Jenny, feel free to add if you have any additional information. So.
I think that's probably about it. The recovery plan will be similar. There'll be points where we'll need more input or less input, and sending stuff out for review. So I guess if you're interested in something in particular, maybe let us know. Yeah,
and we're trying to cast a pretty broad net for that as well. So getting names from folks attending here is probably a good source of folks that would be interested and have information and interest. So.
Awesome. So you got a couple thank yous. Jenna's raising her hand. Let me find you. Once again. You can go ahead and unmute yourself, Jenna.
Just as a follow-up question, would it be appropriate for some of the maybe the input you wanted a broader net for? Would it be appropriate for the working group I could send out an email to the working group and have a link for that type of meeting, and then those that were part of the working group that were interested could come to that meeting and provide input? Or would that just be too much, too many people, too many cooks in the kitchen?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely reach out because of course you have a broad list of contacts and folks that might be interested and have useful information. So that would be good to get those out to folks.
Okay, just keep me in the loop and I can send something out. Or John Stanek can also send something out. He's kind of the head of the listserv.
Great. If there's no other questions, we'll just give it a minute. Don't worry. But if there's no others, we have a break until 10:15. So if we want to just mute ourselves and just meet back here in 10:15. Perfect.